Don't you know that I left my sins behind? Oh yeah, down by the river. You know that I left my.
My name is Judy Richardson, and I'm currently also with the SNCC Legacy Project Board. I come into SNCC in 1963. Well, actually, it starts in 62. At that point, I'm at Swarthmore College, a college in Pennsylvania, and I come into SNCC through the Cambridge, Maryland movement, which was a SNCC affiliate. And then I go into the national office. I become the secretary to Jim Foreman, who was he was the executive secretary. And I get a bird's eye view of the whole organization. And then we move that down to the national office down to Mississippi the summer of 1964. And so I'm there during 64, and then I move into Alabama in 65, do some work in Cordele, Georgia, and Southwest Georgia in 65. Then I leave, and then I get into filmmaking, and I am now both, it's kind of a dual track of filmmaking, starting with the 14 hours of Eyes on the Prize, most recently with the film for the Frederick Douglass National Park Service here in Washington, D.C. But I'm currently working on three other National Park Service, not National Park Service, three other African American history museums in Memphis and out in Memphis, in Atlanta. There's a Jim Crow Museum. Anyway, there are others. And then at the same time, I'm doing education work. So, and I was also a visiting professor at Brown University. And so it's kind of both tracks, education, filmmaking, but everything I do is grounded in what I learned as a SNCC organizer in, the only youth organized and youth-led civil rights movement in the South at that time. I'm going to speak both as someone who teaches this history and also as someone who experienced it in 1964 in terms of Freedom Summer. And as I said, I was at that time in SNCC's national office in Atlanta. We had moved a major portion of the national office to Mississippi that summer of 1964. And the national office, included our research department, our photo department, our communications department, which Julian Bond was head of, the Northern Support with all our networks and colleges and throughout the country. So all of that kind of moves to Greenwood, Mississippi during summer of 64. And at the beginning of Freedom Summer, those three particular voting rights workers had disappeared. And we in the movement knew they were dead. We knew that immediately when they did not report back, because all of the organizers were supposed to call in twice a day on their walkie-talkies, and they had not done that. So the workers, as many know, were James Chaney, who was a local Black organizer, Michael Schwerner, a staff organizer with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which was a partner organization in Mississippi with SNCC. And then Andy Goodman, who was a Freedom Summer volunteer, and it was his first day. That was his first day in Mississippi. So I'm just hoping that people keep in mind a few things as you and I talk. First of all, that SNCC had been in Mississippi working with local Mississippi leaders since 1961. When Bob Moses, SNCC's main project director in Mississippi, first goes into Mississippi at the suggestion of our main mentor, Miss Ella Baker. So that's number two. We were working with local leaders. Number two, local leaders have been working for voting rights and economic justice, because a lot of them a number of them were landowners. So many of them have been working for voting rights and economic justice for years, particularly after many Black veterans returned from World War II, like Medgar Evers, Amzie Moore. And number three, that the Freedom Schools were just one part of Freedom Summer, of our campaign. And most of it was focused on supporting the main focus, which was two parts: building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to challenge the all-white Democratic Party delegation to that year's Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, right? But the main focus was, bottom line, how do you get Black people registered to vote without getting them killed, right? How do you get them registered to vote without getting them killed? So number four, we're doing all this in an environment of extreme and systemic racist white violence. And many local leaders had been killed right before those three were killed in 64. Many local leaders killed for organizing their communities to register to vote. Because Black folks knew long before we got there that the registering to vote was a primary tool for getting power. So Reverend George Lee, Herbert Lee, Lewis Allen, Medgar Evers, all of them had been assassinated for trying to organize Black folks in their communities to try and register to vote in Mississippi. Also, white leaders had been telling the nation that the reason Black people didn't want to vote was because, hey, they trusted white folks to do the right thing and to take care of Black folks' interests. So as a result, we had to, as a movement, prove to the rest of the nation, no, Black folks are not voting because they trust white people to, to move forward their interests, but because they are being killed when they try to register to vote. So as a result, the movement organized the Freedom Vote in 1963. And that was to show that what all these white folks like Senator Stennis and Senator Eastland and all of these sheriffs and others, that what they were saying was a lie. Because in fact, in 1963, in that fall, 80,000 Black people in Mississippi registered to vote as part of the Freedom Vote campaign. And then the fifth thing is to remember that in addition to the Freedom Schools, we organized free health clinics, a free Southern theater that gave theater performances, sometimes to communities that had never seen a live theater performance before. We did citizenship workshops, like what does a mayor do? What does a sheriff do? In order to help Black people understand that they were totally competent to hold many of these jobs now held by racist white people. So that was the kind of foundation and the underpinning of what we were trying to do in Freedom Summer.
Okay. Thank you. So that basically opened up a lot of the questions that I had. What was the purpose in establishing Freedom Schools? What was the goal there?
Yeah. Well, the schools were run by the movement to counter the absolute white supremacist, inaccurate history taught for years in the segregated and really underfunded, that's key, underfunded Black schools. And the general narrative taught in the segregated Black schools and in the white schools, of course, too, because you have to make sure that white people believe the lie as well. So the lie was Black folks should be happy that they were brought over from Africa because, in Africa, hey, we had no culture, we had no history. And by the way, I'm learning that even in Tarrytown, New York, 45 miles north of New York City. So it wasn't just in the Black schools, but except for some Black teachers who were just amazing, who often had hidden troves of Black literature and empowering Black books from Du Bois, from Langston Hughes, from, Carter G. Woodson, and they would bring those up, these Black teachers in these segregated Black schools, when they made sure the white superintendent was nowhere near, or any Black teachers who might tell on them. So there were Black teachers who were teaching this history, but by and large, most Black kids and white kids were not getting the real history. In addition to that, the Black schools were underfunded. So they found out, they did a real survey and found out that in one community, Black schools were getting $1.27 per student. This is in Mississippi, while a white student, also in Mississippi, was getting $191. So $1.27, $191. In addition to the fact that a lot of the Black schools, as was true all over the South, the Black schools were getting, textbooks that were horrible, but still, even in addition to that, were being passed down to the Black schools after the white students had them for 4, 5, 6 years. So they were dog-eared. They were, all crappy. They had underlining. They just looked nasty, but when it wasn't so much a problem of a historical rendering of this history, but more just, where we want to get the facts about this particular chemistry experiment or some math. So STEM, even in terms of STEM, these would be 4 and 5 years having passed through the white children before they ever get to the Black kids. So we're bringing in new books. And I should say, one of the things that Bob Moses, the project director for SNCC and for the Mississippi, for Freedom Summer, along with Dave Dennis, who was the co-director from CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. What Bob often talked about was that what Black kids were getting was a sharecropper education, right? And when he starts the algebra project, for which he gets a MacArthur Genius Grant, and Algebra Project and Young People's Project, of course, is still ongoing. But what Bob said back then and continued to say, even when he's at Harvard Education School, he says what Black kids got was a sharecropper education, which was to basically educate them only to be sharecroppers, not to be chemists, not to be electrical engineers, but to be labor for the white supremacist regime. So, yeah, so that's what we were trying to do was to change that way of so-called teaching Black kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, Black kids and white kids were in these schools?
Well, they were segregated schools. And so you had white kids who were, of course, getting that larger amount of money. And then you had the Black schools, because in Mississippi, all schools were segregated. You had Black schools and you had white schools. And the Black schools got a teeny tiny. That's why I mentioned that difference in expenditure. And by the way, that is one of the things that still exists, that real gap between funding of Black schools and funding of white schools.
So the freedom schools, those were open to Black students only, or were they open to white students too?
Oh, though the freedom schools would have been open to white students, but none of them wanted to come, because it was assumed that if you were with Black kids, one of the lies that white supremacists always say is basically Black kids, Black people. The reason that they don't have what we white people have is because they're slower, they're less intelligent, they don't work as hard, they don't have any history, they don't have any culture. And so why, as a white student, would you want to be with them? Now, what's interesting is that in Mississippi and through much of the Deep South, Black and white kids played together, particularly poor white kids. They played together. When Herbert Lee is killed in 1963 for trying to organizing around the right to vote. And as a matter of fact, Bob Moses is working with him when he goes in to Mississippi. Herbert Lee is told by his white neighbor, E.H. Hurst, look, he said E.H. Hurst, who was a white state legislator, says to Herbert Lee, his neighbor, you need to stop messing with this, voter registration stuff, because you're going to get killed. Now, Herbert Lee and E.H. Hurst were neighbors, white state legislator, Black NAACP organizer. And then Herbert Lee, of course, says, oh, nobody's going to do anything, Well, in fact, he goes into town one day, 63, and is stopped by his neighbor, E.H. Hurst. And I'm trying to think if I could stop just a second, because I'm pretty sure that was actually 1961. Yes, I'm sorry, 1961 this happened. So Herbert Lee, it's 1961, Herbert Lee goes into town, Liberty, Mississippi, which is where the kind of downtown, so-called downtown in this rural area was. And he goes and he has his truck, he gets out of his truck, his neighbor, white neighbor, E.H. Hurst, gets out of the truck and says, look, you need to stop doing all that voter registration mess. And then pulls out a gun and shoots Herbert Lee, his neighbor, dead in the town square in Liberty, Mississippi. And then, of course, there is a trial, and the all-white jury finds that E.H. Hurst was correct in saying that his neighbor Herbert Lee had pulled a gun on him, which is why he shot him
Mhm.
dead.
Mhm.
Now, when Lewis Allen then says later, we find somebody who saw it, a Black person, who says, "I will testify in this case." And uh, Lewis Allen comes to the movement, and Bob Moses and others in SNCC go to the Justice Department and say, "Look, we found somebody who is willing to testify, but only if he is given protection." And the Justice Department says, "Well, um, we don't have the manpower to do this, to protect him. And secondly, he's probably going to be killed anyway."
Mhm.
And in fact, he is killed. The night before the movement is to get him north and out of harm's way, he is killed as he's going into the front of his house.
Mhm.
So this is the kind of environment that you have. And I'm trying to remember, you were asking about the segregated schools. So up until a certain point, young white kids and young Black kids, now that wasn't in terms of white young women, but in terms of young Black and white guys, up until about the time they're, 9, 10 years old, they're playing together. They're playing
Mhm.
ball together.
Mhm.
But the point comes when you get to a certain point, all of that stops. And the white kids go to the white schools, and the Black kids go to the Black schools, and the Black schools get far less funding than the white schools. So
Mhm.
yes, the freedom schools would have been were open to whoever will let them come. But white kids did not want to be associated with anything, and certainly didn't want to be associated with the civil
Mhm.
rights movement.
I'm
Curriculum in the freedom schools was different from traditional schools, even in terms of Black schools, because
Mhm.
students were exposed to kind of this wider world of and to a historically accurate sense of Black history, including history about the larger African diaspora worldwide. So it wasn't just African Americans in this country, but also, Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, and the newly independent African nations in Ghana and Nigeria, and kings and queens and Timbuktu, and the universities there. So we were teaching the real history. But the other thing that folks in the freedom schools were taught was to question, to not just get stuck in what is, but to imagine what can be. So sometimes they were given a copy of the Mississippi State Constitution, right? And then they discussed, young people, does this speak to your community's need? Does it even speak to the needs of poor white people, right? Whose interest does this Mississippi State Constitution serve? Whose interest, right? We also started libraries. So we got, books on Langston Hughes, Du Bois, Harry Tubman, um, uh, and summer volunteers often helped in that effort because they would do sending letters back home to, Lansing, Michigan, or New York City, or
Mhm.
Berkeley, California, or wherever, to say, this is where I am, and there is no library. And if there is a library, it is for white people only, and white students, white children only. And so there are all these wonderful books coming down. And in one of the communities, and we show this, as a matter of fact, in one of the 6 booklets that we have. This is voting rights in our NEH SNCC Legacy Project. We did a whole series of toolkits, and this one was on freedom teaching, and
Mhm.
it talks about Laurel, Mississippi, where, and I'm going to see if I can find a photo of this, where the students actually built the adults built their own library. Now, it was then, because it was so dangerous to be as a library, it was then shot into. No, not it was shot into, and it was also then firebombed, and it was destroyed. But the community understood how important that library was. And you'll see, if you can see this, this is a photo
Mhm.
of them guarding. This is a volunteer and a local Black Mississippian in Laurel who would help build that library. And they're sitting there guarding the library. So folks always understood the need for education and the need for education that would really empower, their kids and their whole community. And so we started these, and the summer volunteers really helped in that effort, as did many of our efforts with our Northern Support Network.
Okay, awesome. So why was Mississippi chosen as a focal point for this campaign?
Yeah. Okay. Let me skip down. Okay. Well, we knew that Mississippi was the worst of the worst, right? That if we could crack that bastion of white supremacy and show Black folks it was possible, then voter registration efforts in other Dixiecrat, that's what we call them, hardline, deep South states, like Alabama and Georgia, Arkansas as well, that those states would then, where we were working, they would then open up. And that you go to the worst of the worst. It's kind of like being in prison, right? What they tell you is if you can crack the hardest head, the worst one, and show that you can beat him. It's like any bully. If you can beat the bully, then you have a lot more room to move. Yeah.
Awesome. How did Freedom Summer change the
I'm
trajectory
sorry.
of the civil rights
If
movement?
you could do me a favor, because you had mentioned also something about what was Mississippi like at the time.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Because I think it's important to understand what we were up against and what local leaders had been up against even before we got there. Because again, they've been working on this for years, right? And so Mississippi was a police state. I mean, that's what it was. And so sheriffs could disappear you, kind of the way Trump is, and the administration is disappearing undocumented people now and anybody who opposes them. So in that same way, when you were arrested, oftentimes, if you were Black in Mississippi, you would disappear into Parchman Prison and never be heard from again, which is why we oftentimes, we developed something called the Watts line out of our national office. And the Watts line was the WATS, the Wide Area Telephone Service. It was an 800 line. So if somebody got arrested, they would then call us in the national office in Atlanta and say Mary Lane, a local organizer in Greenwood. She's been arrested. We would then call Mrs. Shaw in Chicago, a very authority sounding Black woman in Chicago. And we would call Mrs. Shaw and say, Mrs. Shaw, Mary Lane has been arrested. And so then Mrs. Shaw would then call the sheriff in Greenwood and say, I understand that you have Mary Lane in your jail and she had better come out the same way she went in. Because what Mrs. Shaw is saying to the sheriff in Greenwood is, we know you got Mary Lane, and so you cannot disappear her. We know you've got her. Because too many Black people, whether they worked for civil rights or not, were disappeared, So we had a network, and we would call somebody in California and somebody in Pennsylvania. And so you would have a number of people calling the sheriff's office or wherever to say, we know you got so-and-so in your jail. And so even before the murders of 14-year-old Emmett Till were set free by that unanimous decision by an all-white jury, this had been that kind of intimidation and violence had been going on. And so white folks put up lots and lots of roadblocks to keep Black people from voting. So to vote, Black folks had to pass a registration test, which was most times not given to white people, that not only asked idiotic questions, like how many bubbles how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, but the test was used by racist white officials to stop Black people from voting, and they were the ones who judged the answers. So in fact, many very well-educated Black teachers, professional folks were rejected, right? And the main thing was, if you tried to register, you were then often subject to violence and intimidation, both physical and economic. Because, many of us remember Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, when she tries to register, she's thrown off the plantation where she's a timekeeper. Then she goes in to stay to live with a friend and her family, and the friend's family. And within weeks, that friend's family, while Mrs. Hamer is there, shots are thrown, are shot into the house. And of course, she loses her livelihood, her family, her
Mhm.
husband, and her kids stay on the plantation, but she is now gone. And she was a main wage earner because she was the timekeeper. And so it's both. And if you have a farm and you're housing, for example, Black movement workers on your farm, you're housing them, you're clothing them, you're guiding them in terms of what people to watch out for. They're both guiding and guarding you, because many of these local people had guns. And the reason a lot of SNCC and CORE people are still here is because there were local people who were protecting us, right? But a lot of those folks, they were in jeopardy of losing their mortgages because the white
Mhm.
banks held the mortgage and would often say, unless you stop trying to organize Black voters, we're going to pull your mortgage. So there were a lot of levers that white supremacists had to use to try and stop the Black voter registration effort. Yeah.
Mhm. All right. So how did Freedom Summer change the trajectory of the civil rights movement?
Well, I think it helped give some protection to Black Mississippians who were leading in the struggle, who had been leading, trying to get this Black folks registered to vote. And so, which the reason that you could see, for example, all of these Black folks coming to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was
Mhm.
because you had some protection. You know, you had, and I should say, when the 700 white students come down, they're primarily white students. And then I'll just go ahead.
Okay. What do you believe is the most important aspect of education for teaching young students about creating civic and political change?
I think, the most important thing is that you really can be part of this change, that you don't have to wait for some great leader. I mean, one of the mistakes that we made, it is the grand narrative, kind of, that it was only Dr. King who did this, and he was amazing. I mean, there is no getting around that. But that he was not the only leader. He was the most famous one, and he was incredible. He had all the things that you would want in a leader. But there were many local leaders who were plowing the ground before the national civil rights movement ever gets there. And so one of the important things to talk to students about is that, we SNCC folk, for example, were their age when we were doing whatever we were doing in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, Arkansas. We were 18, 19, 20 years old. All right. And so the importance is knowing that we were your age when we were changing the world as I knew it. That you can change, that you can organize people to change for good. And that the folks who made that change weren't just people with the greatness of Dr. King, right? They were your cousins and your uncles and your mothers and your clergy and your teachers, that it was just regular people who made that change, who created
Mhm.
the change in that we're experiencing now, and really trying to stop a lot of folks from moving back to the 1950s. But that change did occur, and they can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? We did change. And
Mhm.
so what we need to understand is that we made the change. All of us, regular people, once we got together, decided these are the things we're going to focus on. And one of the things to understand is that at this point, even though the economics in Mississippi, for example, they have really horrible, maternity, mortality rates, the healthcare, but that has to do with who is in control at the state house, right? Uh, but within Black Mississippi, there are Black Mississippians, including young people, who realize we really can do something, and that's really crucial. It's not just that you've got white people oppressing you; it's that you believe that they are right, then nothing can change. And once you believe that, it's all over. You can never change anything. And so you have to believe, yes, I can do it because others did it before me, which is why there are those who don't want you to know that others did it before you. And they really made change, because that's what any good social movement does, right? It changes things, not just for the people in who like Black folks, right? I mean, we weren't just changing it for expanding rights for Black people. We're expanding rights for all people of color, for all people. You know, you even find that when I do teacher workshops, for example, around Eyes on the Prize, when you look at what they say in Montgomery during the bus boycott, you know, you see Abernathy, Reverend Abernathy up there. After Rosa Parks has, you know, has refused to get up, and they're doing the boycott for 384 days, right? One of the things he says when they win the Supreme Court decision is, we didn't just change it for, you know, for Black people. We didn't change it in Montgomery. We didn't just change it for Black people in the nation. We changed it for all people, you know, all right-thinking people, because you are expanding rights for everybody, which is what the civil rights movement always does. So I would say, one of the things you're trying to explain in the narrative about how we did this in Mississippi and throughout the South was regular people were the organizers, regular people were the leaders. They weren't just the troops, they were the leaders of this movement, and change did happen. Yeah.
Okay. What values were emphasized in freedom schools?
Well, one of I'll just say that it was very much based on the values that we had in SNCC. You know, it was non-hierarchical. You know, everyone had an equal voice, whether they were within the freedom schools, whether they were the preacher's kid or a child of a teacher or a sharecropper's child. It was very much, we are all equal in this space. And the sense that we could all learn from each other. And that's very much the way it was in staff meetings, in, you know, when we had meetings in SNCC. You know, it was about the work. It was about who did the work best. It wasn't about whether your parents were a sharecropper or whether your parents were a teacher. That the good ideas were coming from lots of different kinds of folks, you know, and you will see that in terms of the leadership of SNCC, you know. So a lot of it was, we're non-hierarchical. Yes, we have Jim Foreman, who was our executive secretary. Yes, John Lewis is our chairman. But a lot of that, I mean, Joyce Ladner, who is from Mississippi, of course, she said, you know, SNCC people could argue with a telephone pole, because we always questioned who's making this decision. Is it right for what we want to do as an organization? And we oftentimes went by consensus. And so that's how we operated in SNCC, because our lives were on the line. And so even if you didn't agree with the decision, part of consensus thinking was, even if you don't agree, are you willing to go with the decision that we have just made? And that's because the decision was really about whether you're going to live and die or die in many of these places. So we're thinking about all of that. And so it is important that everybody who is part of this decision making is not just the leaders, it's everybody who's sitting in this room. And so we did the same thing with freedom schools. You know, it's like everybody gets to, you know, talk about the curriculum and be part of making, you know, talking about this US Mississippi State Constitution. The sense that we're all learning from each other. And also the assumption was that what SNCC was doing with freedom teaching, we called it freedom. I mean, we now call it freedom teaching. We didn't say it that way then, but freedom teaching was that this was education for liberation, that it wasn't just education for its own sake, that there was a purpose. And the purpose was to empower Black people so they could have a say in what happened in their communities. You know, many of these communities, they were 80% Black. And you know, you were lucky if you had one Black registered voter who had been allowed in. So what we're saying, what we're doing with Freedom Summer and the Freedom Schools is to show education is important, but it's not just so that you know, so you can quote from Langston Hughes or Du Bois or whatever, or Zora Neale Hurston. It's not that. It is that you are going to use this education. It's kind of each one teach one. That has always been a through line in Black communities since we got here.
Mhm.
So yeah, that sense of education for liberation was very much a part of the Freedom Schools.
So, what was the role of college students and volunteers in Freedom Summer and for the Freedom Schools?
Yeah, as I mentioned, so many Black leaders had been killed in Mississippi, organizing around the right to vote. So it was clear we needed to do something to get the attention of white America. And we knew that if the children of Northern white folks came down, the media would follow them. And this is a time when television is just getting off, so you had ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so the media following meant that the attention of much of white America would follow with them. So a lot of this media came down, and particularly came down after those three civil rights workers were missing, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. And
Mhm.
so we developed press packets. And one of them, for example, is one that people can see on our SNCC Digital website that is hosted by Duke University. And it's this, and you can get it on Civil Rights Movement CRM Vet. It's civilrightsmovementvets.org. But
Mhm.
we developed press packets, and we included in it this. It's called a Mississippi chronology, and of violence and intimidation, and it had all of the reports that we had taken when we did those every 2 days a week, calling around to all of our projects in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia. And we have, like, for example, the Herbert Lee. This is in this chronology. And it says September 25th, Herbert Lee had been active in voter registration, was shot and killed by white state representative E.H. Hurst in downtown Liberty. No prosecution was undertaken. Representative said he had shot in self-defense. We have something around Ivanhoe. We have something around a number of the workers, Jimmy Travis, Mississippi. We have a photo of him when he was shot in the neck and shoulder, and he was in the hospital for 6 weeks. We thought we had lost him. But what we were
Mhm.
doing with this, that again, we put in the press packets for all this northern media that's coming down, newspapers, television, radio, to show that what they're seeing by some southern white sheriff is not an anomaly. It is not the exception. Because what they want to say is, oh, that's, as they call them, the rednecks. Oh, it's just some ignorant redneck sheriff. No, this is the hierarchy. These are the elected officials in Mississippi who are governing Mississippi. And these are the people who can kill at will and not have anything happen to them. So we wanted to show the systemic nature of white supremacy. And that's what we did with this, to show it's not just one or two. It's not just Mayor Thompson, mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, who gets a tank, a U.S. tank, and puts it in the downtown in Jackson to show that he's ready for these movement workers, civil rights movement workers, and he's got a tank, and what he's saying to people and the media is, and none of our Black people, he's saying, this white supremacist, none of our Black people would be doing any of this. It's all of these, communists who are putting this, who are stirring them up, right? And all these movement people who are stirring our local people, our local Black people are happy. That was what we were trying to show the lie to, right? We were trying to show they are not happy. It's just that they get killed for trying to register to vote. So we did that. I will show you, I have a form that we had to fill out. This is a form for those who were not already organizing in the state, as we call Mississippi. And so this was the form that I filled out. I still have a copy. And it was so that, and it says at the very top of it, you will see here, it says, in case of emergency, always contact only my sister, right? And I have her number because I knew if anything happened to me during 1964 Mississippi, and they called my mother would freak, right? So call my sister first. Let her tell my mother if something's happened to me, right? And so you had your high school, you had all this information that you put in. But then the other thing, which was really key, is that they ask for the hometown college newspapers, anything that was media that SNCC could then contact to get, again, attention on what had happened to you, and therefore, by expansion, what was happening in terms of the work we were doing in Mississippi. So, for example, if you were, as one of them was, the son of a California congressman, then if anything happened to that white son of the California congressman, then all of the media from California would be interested in that. So we want to make sure we had on this application all of the, the TV, anything, and any contact information he might have. So all of that was to try and lend some kind of protection to all of this campaign that had been going on for decades to get Black people registered to vote. And in some ways it worked. I mean, when those three first come missing, you realize, oh, white people say, oh, wait a minute, you mean people get killed for trying to register to vote? I mean, it was like a little light bulb went out, like they didn't know this before. So, but it also meant that we got more FBI agents, all white, many of them former Southern sheriffs, but still, because the media was there, they then had to make more of a show of not letting it be so obvious that Black people were getting killed over the right to vote.
What legacy do you think that Freedom Summer, Freedom Schools left in Mississippi?
Well, I will say that Mississippi now has more Black elected officials than any other state in the union. Now, does it mean that economics are right? No, but economics aren't right anywhere in the country. They have more Black elected officials than in any other state in the union, and that's as a result of the organizing that went on during Freedom Summer, but before and after, right? You had Mrs. Unita Blackwell, who incorporates her town. She's one of the delegates to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She incorporates her town of Mayersville, Mississippi, and they get funding, that they would not have gotten had it not been incorporated, and also had it not been, had she not been the mayor, the Black female mayor of Mayersville, Mississippi, right? She also becomes one of the directors for the, they call it the Council of, it's for the smaller communities nationally, and they get together. I can't remember the name of it, but she becomes the head of that. I would also say, for example, the head of the National NAACP, Derek Johnson, credits Mississippi SNCC organizers like Hollis Watkins to understand the importance of movement and how you move, how to organize. And he will say that today. I would also say that the children of Freedom Schools, who are now adults, of course, many of them talk about how important that experience was to help them understand that things could be different, but more importantly, that they could be part of that change. And so it's not just that it opens their world to a world outside their small community in Mississippi, but to what's going on all over the world. But it's also that they understand that they can be part of this change. And then I would also just mention that Eddie Carthen, who was a Freedom School student, and we have also a photo of him in that Freedom teaching toolkit. He later becomes mayor of the town of Chula, Mississippi. And he talks about how everything opened up for him when he went into that Freedom School in 1964. He just saw the world differently.
Okay. So I'll have to go on these pictures are on SNCC digital gateway, correct?
Yes, and what I can do, let me know which photos you need, and certainly where the well, for example, the where the toolkits are, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you can, I think in Freedom Teaching they may go to some of those, but I can I'm trying to think. Yes, I'm pretty sure. Oh no, voting rights, that one may, in terms of Certainly in terms of, oh, I never mentioned Charlie. Oh gosh. Can I do one thing? Because there is one other
Mhm.
thing I would mention in terms of the Freedom Schools.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things we also produced materials for the Freedom Schools. And so not only did we talk about haiku, how do you write what you're thinking in the format of a haiku, but we produced something called, it was called Negroes in American History. And it was produced by two SNCC, two white SNCC volunteers, Frank Chichorka and his wife, Bobby Chichorka. And what it did is it had all of these wonderful uh, pieces around like the American Revolution, then the black soldiers, Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian Revolution, slave revolts, Negroes and Indians, because we were called Negroes then, right? Negroes and Indians, women in the movement, Frederick Douglass, Reconstruction, Du Bois. All of this is part of the contents of this booklet, which, by the way, I helped distribute. And I have in my archives a letter from Coretta Scott King, because I contacted her to see if she wanted to carry them in the Southern Christian Leadership, Dr. King's organization, their citizenship schools, and got something back and said, oh, I'd really like to talk to you about that. So we did that. But what's important is not only what's in it, and it's really lovely for the time, because again, we're trying to upset the traditional narrative that Black kids are getting about their history in these freedom schools. But the other thing is that Charlie Cobb, SNCC organizer in Mississippi, who comes from a long history of educators, including during enslavement, when his great-great-great-grandfather was an educator in Greenville, Mississippi, right? But Charlie is the one who comes up with the idea of freedom schools. And so he writes the intro to this wonderful Negro history primer. And he says, this is a history book about us. It is about a history that has been denied us by lies about what we are and what we have been. And he says, what we learn from this book about us is that there is a lot about us that we don't know, which raised the question why we don't know. That big question, why, is a threat and a challenge to the people who have kept us from knowing us, which makes this a very dangerous book to those who don't want us to know about us. And he says, you see, to ask questions really means to try and find truth, which really means to ask more questions, and that's dangerous. Now, that's from Charlie Cobb as the intro of this wonderful, primer that we developed in 1965. And, and as the founder of, the initiator, because a number of people worked on the freedom schools, like Staunton Lind, who worked on the curriculum. But, Charlie Cobb, there's always this line of education throughout SNCC, both internally within SNCC staff and also externally. And how do you use education for liberation? Yeah.
All right.
I'm so glad you did this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okie dokie. Okay, bye-bye
Bye-bye.
now.